You are listening to the Think Brick Australia podcast. Think Brick Australia represents the clay, brick and paver manufacturers of Australia. Brick by brick, our podcast will discuss technical information and architectural case studies with special guests. I'm your host, Elizabeth McIntyre, the CEO of Think Brick Australia. On today's podcast, I'm welcoming someone that has made me wait nearly over 12 to 18 months, but I can tell you it's been well worth the wait. Welcome, Patrick Kennedy from Kennedy Nolan.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Wasn't designed to be difficult, just that I just wanted you to be really sure that you wanted me on this podcast.
Love it. Now, Patrick, I know a lot of your history, but maybe just for our listeners, you could just talk to us a little bit around where you grew up and a little bit about your childhood.
Okay, so I grew up in different parts of country Victoria. I was born in a place called Springhurst near Wangaratta, so Northeast Victoria, and we lived in Stawell in Western Victoria, and then we lived in Corryong in the Snowy Mountains. And then I spent most of my childhood in Wodonga, which is on the Murray River, across the river from Albury, where my business partner Rachel grew up, although we never knew each other until we were at university. So we lived in the same residential college at Melbourne University, and that's where we met. But yeah, it was a lovely childhood. I have three brothers. We did a lot of things together as a family.
Was there a reason you were moving around a lot?
Because my dad was a teacher.
Okay.
And in those days, that's what the Department of Education did. They would send people to different spots.
Yeah, right.
And then we ended up in Wodonga. And now all my family live in Melbourne. So I have my three brothers all live down here, and my parents live down here too. But yeah, it was a really nice childhood.
Did you find moving around, were you always going to different schools? Was that?
Well, I was only at really two schools.
Okay.
So it was, most of the moving was when I was under 8.
Yeah.
But I guess the place that stuck in my mind the most was when we lived in Corryong. So it's such a beautiful little town, and we were at a tiny little Catholic school with just a couple of nuns, and it was in a beautiful spot, and it was a lovely little community, and my brothers and I all have such fond memories of that place.
And do you think now that living in, obviously, inner city Victoria, what perspective did it give you growing up in regional Victoria?
Well, I have to say I don't really yearn to live in regional Victoria anymore.
Yeah.
I feel like more of a city person, but it was kind of perfect as a child. And as I said, our family was really close and we did lots of things together. We used to go cross-country skiing up in the Snowy Mountains, all of us together, which was really fun. And we had some little dinghies, which we used to sail at the Albury Yacht Club, which things we could all do together as a family.
Yeah.
So it was actually pretty idyllic, really. But I guess now my interests lie very much in the city, particularly professionally, but also the things that I love doing now that I'm interested in.
And so when did sort of this career or even studying architecture, when did that sort of come to you as an idea or a desire?
Well, I think Mum and Dad always were interested in design themselves. It wasn't their area, but they were always interested in it, and they used to show us things. And my interest was peaked very, very young. And I remember my cousins had a house designed by Graham Gunn. It was a merchant builder's house. It was an early one, and Graham had done it himself. And I just loved this house. It was in sort of a bushy part of Melbourne, and it really just captured my imagination.
What was it about the house?
Well, it felt really different to other houses I'd seen. It was really textural. It was very expressive of the materiality. It was all exposed brickwork, which I loved. It was on the interior as well as the exterior. So it smelt different. It had a real understanding of how pleasurable domestic space could be, because it wasn't bland. Everything felt sort of atmospheric. They created atmospheres because the lighting wasn't consistent, and there was always everything open onto gardens, and there were different aspects and over different levels as well. It was on quite a steep hill. So I think that really stuck in my mind as an early memory. I remember going to the National Gallery. It's a pretty standard sort of memory, coming across that Roy Grounds building, the water wall, of course, but also the interiors, which I just thought was so exciting. The courtyards and the monumental nature of it, the bluestone, the way it's used, and being able to see the saw cuts on it and the Leonard French ceiling. So that's a really pivotal memory I have as well. And things in Canberra, the High Court, the National Gallery, I just was completely sort of awestruck by those buildings. They just really embedded in my imagination. And I think that's where I first started thinking about architecture.
Okay. And then were you supported, so then you came up with that idea and then it obviously then carried through to be a university of choice?
Well, I wanted to be an architect, and one of my dad's friends was an architect, and so I did work experience with him and I really enjoyed it. Okay. But then when I went to university, I just decided I didn't want to commit to it. Okay. And my cousin, who I was close to, she had been doing an arts degree and she talked about it and I thought it was really interesting. And my parents really encouraged me and my brothers all to do an arts degree. Okay. So I actually started with an arts degree with French, history, English and fine arts. And I finished that degree as well. But what happened was when I was living in college at Newman College at Melbourne Uni, I met Rachel, and she was the year above me and she was studying architecture. And I remember very clearly being in her room and watching what she was doing. In those days, we had drawing boards, these big drawing boards, and she'd be drawing on this drawing board these certain projects. And I remember one project she was doing in particular, which was they had to all imagine an extension to a Mario Botta building. Mm-hmm. And I just thought this was so fascinating. And it just really completely reignited my interest in architecture. And so then I applied to do it the following year, and that's what happened.
And then just going back to, I guess for me, architecture is such a mix, or from what I've observed, of drawing and then obviously the mathematical side. Which part do you enjoy the most?
Well, I enjoy there's so many parts to architecture. It's not just those two. There's all sorts.
I'm being really generalistic here, but in those early stages.
Oh, I think it's the creative. I mean, it's the will to create, the urge to create. I think that's that would be the main thing. The idea that you can make something. So it has got a sort of artistic. I think all architects sort of hesitate to describe themselves as artists because it sounds sort of pretentious or sort of not quite right. But it is actually about creativity. It is about making things, about imagining things. And so that's definitely the major thing for me.
And it's always interesting because I came from Disney to this.
Yeah.
And everyone goes, how did you go from Disney to bricks? But actually working with architects is really very similar to working with creative people because that's exactly what you are.
Very difficult.
I didn't say any of that. So then you enroll, and so now you're in architecture, but you're a year behind Rachel at university.
She was a year above me at uni anyway, so I would have been 2 years behind. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And so so then what was the rest of that university degree like now that you've changed direction?
Well, it was slow for me because living in college, there were a lot of distractions, and architecture requires pretty consistent attendance, and that didn't really happen all the time.
Oh, well, this is a shock.
So it was a slow progress through architecture. Okay. And so what happened was I would have to repeat subjects in architecture, but the upside to that was that I was able to finish my arts degree while alongside, which was good, but it meant that I was at university for a very long time. Okay. I think 10 years in the end.
Right. So living on campus all that time?
God, no. I mean, no. I mean, you can't stay in college for that long. No. So, but I lived in the area, so I moved out of college to North Melbourne, and then I moved to Fitzroy, and I was always in the area. But look, it was a different time. It was really fun. There's lots of fun going on. And also there was quite a deep recession. So it wasn't like chomping at the bit to get out and starting my career because there wasn't much going on.
Yeah. So then you finish that, and what happens next?
Well, before I finished, at that time at Melbourne University, you had to do a year of practical experience before you could go into your final 2 years. And Rachel was working in a practice in Carlton, and because of that connection, I was able to get a position there. And so I ended up working there for Victoria Hamer in Carlton, and I worked there until I finished my degree. And then I did another year. Rachel had left by this stage, and I did another year with Victoria. And towards the end of that year, Rachel and I thought we've got something we want to do. We had ideas about what we wanted to do in architecture, and we looked around and we couldn't see them being done. And we thought, we're going to do it. We've got nothing to lose. Mm-hmm. And it was a good time to start a practice because the profession had been pretty much decimated by the recession, and there weren't, unlike now, there weren't many practices around. And so it wasn't like we were going into a highly competitive market. Like, we're going to start a practice. There weren't many other practices around. We had friends, because we'd been in college, who weren't all architects, who were starting to want to do things. So they were small, but we had some projects. And the first project we did was for my cousin. And so we just threw ourselves into it.
And just thinking back to that time, what did you think what you wanted to do? What was the difference back then, what in your mind? How were you approaching things differently that you wanted to go out on your own?
Well, I mean, to be honest, architecture in our heads at that time was very much based around residential architecture, around houses, and which is still really important to us, but it's a more diverse practice now. And I think we looked at residential architecture and we found it a bit austere and a bit bland, and we found the things that we wanted to do were we wanted to reconnect to that late modernism that merchant builders exemplified. We wanted to find a much closer balance between architecture and landscape. We wanted to look at how colour could be explored, and not to suck up to your professional organisation, but we wanted to use bricks because it was a material which was really out of fashion. Everything was rendered. You never saw bricks, and we wanted to use them. So we felt like there were these things that weren't existing, and we had these ideas and this imagination about what residential architecture could be, and so that's what sort of pushed us forward. And so
you got the first role with your cousin, and then how did you go on from there?
It was just very organic. I mean, it was just the two of us initially working out of a building that Rachel and her husband owned, and it was pretty loose. We used to smoke at our desks and go to the pool and but we weren't expecting a lot out of it at that point. But we were meeting lots of people. We were around lots of people. It was a good time to start a practice. So the first project we did for my cousin, it won an award that year, won a Victorian Architecture Award. So we started to build momentum pretty quickly in the practice, and it just grew very incrementally.
And then aside from that first project, if you looked back in those sort of beginning years, is there a project that really defines that time for you? Or
I wouldn't say there was a particular project. They all were areas of exploration. And I think when it was just the two of us, and then soon after that, our Emma Mitchell came to join us, who still remains a friend. Everything was an exploration of something new, new ideas. So I look back at the projects and I see that we're all trying different things. We weren't actually developing a house style. We weren't developing a Kennedy Nolan style as such. We were really looking at projects on their own basis, first principles basis each time. And so they all look like different preoccupations at different times. And we still try and do that. And I think there's still a diversity apparent in our projects, which is because that's what makes it fun for us, is to look at each new project and think, well, what's this one about? I mean, we bring our sensibility to it, but it's like, what does this project deserve? What does it need? What could it be? So when I look back on those earlier projects, I feel like they're all explorations, some of which come back today. Even some of those ideas still come back.
Yep. One of the things when I interviewed Rachel, she talked about how the partnership that you had, and also how you do a lot of things that aren't anything to do with architecture. And I just wondered, you've gone on you've explored overseas. Has any particular architecture from other parts of the world really influenced how you do things?
Look, I wouldn't say specifically it has.
No?
Not architecture. I think it's really good to see other things, because in every different place, there's different building conventions, and there's different materiality, and there's even different ways of inhabiting buildings, different details, different regulations. They all end up with making buildings look different. And I do find that really fascinating, just the way the forces of a society make things look even subtly different. But there's nothing specific for me. I mean, I have to say my holidays or my travel is not about architecture ever, really. It's about trying to sort of relax and rest, but also just to open my eyes to things which I don't just what I come across. And I think that's an important thing too, is not to use architecture as an inspiration for architecture all the time. And it's obviously a very useful one, but when it feels like architecture can be more authentic and the inspiration comes more easily when it actually reflects everything in the world, not just other buildings. So I think travel is about keeping your eyes open to everything.
I agree. Where do you see the role of architects sort of coming into a world now that's starting to get some awareness around the environment and where things sit? What role do you think architects play in that?
Oh, it's absolutely pivotal. It's so important. And I think it's really interesting. Architects have always embraced innovation. So if we look at, as another example or an analogy, you look at what happened in the 20th century, where there were, coming out of World War I, there were huge problems about social inequity and also about standard of living and housing. So a lot of those solutions were solved by architects. So we sort of take it for granted now, but they looked at, how do we accommodate people? How do we house people in a dignified way? How do we deal with things like sanitation and airflow for health? How do we imagine cities and what they can be after they've been destroyed? So a lot of that innovation drew on modernist principles more broadly in all sorts of areas, but architects actually applied it and actually solved a lot of problems. I mean, it's not perfect, obviously. There are a lot of bad outcomes from that, but it was a genuine optimism and enthusiasm for change and innovation driven by architects, because they just can't help but want to solve problems. And then I think now with the environment and the sustainability issues we have, architects aren't looking anymore, well, most architects aren't looking anymore at sort of previous preoccupations, which are about what it looks like or how spectacular it is, what it feels like. They're thinking, well, how can what I do contribute to solving this problem? So sustainability has become this huge thing now, and architects are really pushing on it. So there's architects declare, so there's lots of carbon neutral practices. This practice is carbon neutral. And then we're really pushing in terms of technology. How do we make our buildings, how do we make them carbon neutral? How do we make them carbon negative? So that's a real impetus. And I think architects are interested in the world and interested in people and interested in how architecture can solve problems. So we're, as a profession, we're really engaged with it, and we'll push it as far as we can.
Do you think that the profession gets the voice it deserves?
Oh, look, I think it possibly gets the voice it deserves, but because it's a pretty introspective, prickly profession. So a lot of people don't like architects, and I can kind of empathise.
Coming up from that perspective, I just think what I've learned in this time is that architects can create something and create it to tick off everything that you've just discussed, and then a builder comes in or an engineer comes in and suddenly things are different. I just wondered whether are there other sectors of construction that get a bigger voice in that?
Yeah, and then definitely the architect. We've lost prestige and we've lost influence and we've lost control in the production.
I didn't mean it to go down that path.
No, but we have in terms of the production of buildings. Like an architect from 50 years ago was basically calling the shots on what happened. And now we have another whole sort of layers of people like project managers and so on. And we're just another cog in the wheel. And look, some people would say there are good reasons for that. I think there's two arguments to that discussion. Project management can be really effective and useful, but it actually can also have a really deadening effect. Yeah. And it can prioritise the wrong things. And we're now in an environment where regulation is really stifling architecture, and well, just not architecture, everything, and risk, over sensitivity to risk. I think we've lost a lot of the bravery, we've lost a lot of the verve. People talk about exciting, fun, or not fun, but exciting, innovative, amazing buildings. I mean, they're so difficult to achieve now in the regulatory environment, and the financial controls that we have to deal with, and also the structures of how they're delivered. You have to go through 20 committees and 15 project managers and risk officers, and it's deadening.
Yeah. And then what do you see in the younger generations that are coming out now? How does their view differ to perhaps what yours was as architects?
Oh, that's an interesting question. You know what? Embarrassingly, I don't know.
Yeah, okay.
I don't really know. I would be interested to find out.
Okay.
There are so many younger architects, and probably I do need to listen more and take more interest.
No, it's just more like we had a university competition and I had the pleasure of interviewing some really, amazing young architects, and they sort of came to me with this sort of, I guess, looking at the world that normally you'd go in and demolish something and create something new, whereas their perspective was, well, how can you, improve it or keep some of it? And I did think that was kind of refreshing, but you may have thought the same thing. So I guess. Well,
I think that's amazing and fantastic. And I think probably young people are more focused on that, but I think it is the whole profession is focused on that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, look, young people are always going to be more engaged with contemporary issues and feel about them more passionately and fight harder for them. So I think we're all I would like to think we're all broadly on the same sort of path.
Yeah.
But I would agree that younger people generally, I guess, are going to prosecute it and make way more passionate.
Obviously, you've used so much brick in what you've done. Why brick?
Well, I think the thing I like about brick is that, I loved Lego as a kid, another really predictable sort of thing for an architect to say, but I do, it's something about the modularity of brick and the way that it has infinite possibilities as a module. Even
though it seems constrained.
Yeah, but to me, it feels like it can do so many things. Not that we necessarily do a lot of things with it, but it has that potential, that feeling of potential. I love the weight of it. I love the fact that it's made from clay, so it's of the earth. I love the way that it lasts so long. I like the way it handles, like the texture and the feel of it, the way it smells, which sounds weird. But for me, all those things, they feel really real. So if I'm comparing a very light building made from highly manufactured materials, to me, I find it very hard to make an emotional connection to that. Okay. Whereas brick, to me, it feels like it's almost embedded in the psyche of how we make things as humans. And look, that's pretty esoteric sort of thing to say, but I guess I do feel that. I feel like, to me, it means habitation, or it means something about how buildings should feel and look and be constructed. Each brick is touched by a person and put into place by a person. It's kind of something kind of magic about it. And then it's also super regional. So depending on where the clay is from, it means the brick is a different colour. And also they're different module sizes and the mortar's done differently. So it's kind of reflective of these subtle and not so subtle ways of exactly where it comes from too. So it's super regional. There's so many things about it which to me make it a really appealing material.
And just thinking back when you said you first started and you wanted to use brick and it wasn't that contemporary then, what were the conversations like? Were your clients willing to embrace it, or was it something that you really had to convince them about?
No, we had to convince them. Yeah, definitely. And we weren't always successful either. But,
Kennedy smile,
we had to, no, it did not. We had to do a bit of tap dancing, and we had to talk about, and because Rachel and I feel very aligned on these things, we had to talk about, and this is when we first started talking about memories, because we talked about our own memories of bricks, and we started off with, bag brickwork or faced or flush mortar brickwork painted white. And this is still a material we really, really love. And we would just try and paint a picture about what was so compelling about it. We would often talk about Jimmy Watson's wine bar, which was designed by Robin Boyd and has all this white painted brickwork outside and inside. And we just talked about the feeling that it gave you when you went in there, and the way it triggered memories and the way it aged so beautifully. And so then we talked about how family houses could be these repositories or manufacturers of memories. And so that's how we kind of got it across the line, I think.
And then how would you compare that to now? Like, have things changed?
Well, now it's now the material du jour, really. So it's a much less difficult conversation to have.
Okay.
People want it. People like it. The technology's improved. There's like organisations like yourself which provide support technical support and all sorts of industry support. So it's actually a much simpler thing now to use brick. And we have great relationships with the brick companies who are mostly very involved with architects, which is wonderful. And we have genuine friendships. And as I said, it's the material du jour, and people like it, people want it, because I think people are engaging with it right now.
Now, when I look at all of the projects that you've done over the years, there are a couple of signature sort of moves that really stamp on a Kennedy Nolan. Do you know what I'm going to talk about?
Oh, I could probably have a guess, but I'm going to wait and find out.
Oh, wow. Well, I think, it really is the amount of, I want to say portholes, but what's the architecture?
Yeah, okay. Well, you can call it whatever you want. Circles. We do. And I thought you would say that. And it's kind of embarrassing too, the circle thing, in a way, because we now have been so closely sort of aligned to it. But I'll explain why we use them. Because one of the things we feel is one of the hardest things to do in a building is to put a window or put openings into it, windows and doors.
Yeah.
Because if you're looking at a building formally from the outside, windows and doors are representing interior use and so on, but they don't actually necessarily work with an overall approach to the form or the morphology. And so it can make buildings seem sort of, if you're not trying to do something which is completely expressive of function, if you're trying to make something slightly more poetic and you're trying to make people sort of feel something or even see the building, just grids of windows or lots of rectangles on rectangles, we just find it can't do it for us. So what we try and do is we try and imagine the overall form of the building as a creature. Like, we like to think of it as a little friend or a large friend sometimes. And it's a composition of solid and void, so wall and void. And then we sometimes need windows always need windows, but we find the circle so useful because what it does is it acts as a counterpoint to the solid and void, and it can turn a building into one of our little friends because it becomes an eye or a mouth or two eyes, or we just try and find those resonances, and the circle really helps us. It helps us compose a facade. We look at it, and we often draw facades or understand facades in two dimensions because it is actually an arrangement or a composition of texture and proportion and shape and colour, and the circle is a very useful counterpoint, which is why it so often appears.
I love that explanation.
Oh,
Thank
good.
you. Yeah. Patrick, you have not only, I think, appeared in most of our high commendations, but you've also been on the jury of the awards. And I just wondered, what's the awards experience been like for you?
Well, it's a really fun one to be involved with. I mean, I've been on lots of juries, but it's been fun. I've made a friendship with you, which has been really nice. The jury, just the whole atmosphere of it is quite convivial and quite relaxed and really upfront too. There's no sort of politics. A lot of architecture is very distorted by political alliances and allegiances and so on, whereas the Brick Award feels very sort of removed from that. It's a national awards program, which I always think great because it takes you out of your parochial environment, and it means that you don't have to feel like you're working within your tribe. You can look out further, and it's just very well run, and the criteria are really clear. It was a really enjoyable experience for us.
Well, look, there's very few architects that have given so much to the industry and really demonstrated and articulated what you can do with brick. And you've been a wonderful supporter. You have done nearly everything that I've asked you to do or requested.
I think everything, actually.
Everything. But you really have. You've been a tremendous supporter, and I always look forward to seeing what you're designing next. So thanks so
Elizabeth.
much. We're going to go to those rapid fire questions.
Okay.
Reading the news, a newspaper or online?
I am a newspaper person. I have it delivered.
Handwriting or typing?
I prefer handwriting. I mostly handwrite.
For sketching ideas and concepts, would you use a pencil, pen, or an e-pen?
I use a pen.
Do you like to read books or listen to audiobooks?
I'm a book person.
What's important to you, style or substance?
That's a both for me.
Coffee or tea?
Tea.
TV shows or movies?
Well, I like both, but I very rarely see movies, so probably TV.
Antique or brand new?
Both, again.
Call or text?
Definitely call.
Travel back in time or into the future?
I'm too scared to go to the future. I'll go back.
Exterior or interior?
Definitely both.
Video games or board games?
Neither.
Form or function?
Most definitely both.
And complex or simple with relation to design?
Also both. Sorry, I know you didn't want both because Rachel said both and everything, but I do like everything. I do like pluralistic
It's
things.
okay. There's no wrong answers.
Yep.
And Patrick, it's nearly been 2 years, but it's been well worth the wait. Thank you so much for today.
Oh, it's been great for me too, Elizabeth. Thank you.
If you have enjoyed this podcast, please follow, rate, and review our podcast. We are always looking for new ways to think brick. If you have an idea of what you'd like to hear about, there's a link in our show notes to let us know.